Yeah, I work on fish, and I have been for quite a long time, and for the last 8 years it's been only in the Lake Eyre Basin, where I've become somewhat entrenched. We probably don't need to go through that slide again, except to just emphasise, and this is something that I think sometimes gets a bit missed, just emphasise how much of the Lake Eyre Basin is in Queensland. And I'm not trying to be all state boundary about it, but you know, if it wasn't for Queensland, you wouldn't have Lake Eyre filling. Queensland's where all those big rivers run. The 3 big rivers start in Queensland, and most of their length are in Queensland. Important to remember that when you think about all these political implications coming up. Yeah, look, I've broken a lot of things in those 8 years, and that includes all the rules of the university and how you do research and vehicles. And I've driven around this bit of the world now. Like, basically, my job is really more or less driving, and then occasionally fishing. But I worked it out the other day. Like, I've done 45 big, well, not all big, but 45 trips around the place over that time. You know, and never. I've had a few bad days, but still not bored of it. And I think that's one of the important themes of this conference as well, and certainly something that Scott and Angus brought up yesterday. I think there's an imaginary little line on the map that runs up from about Charleville through to Barkey, say. And I think once you're west of there, like, the world's a little bit different, you know, and the backcountry does run to its own little drum. That imaginary line. So, you know, like, you can go to any town, you can go to Boulia or Baduri or over here in the Big Smoke or whatever, but everybody's linked up, you know, and it's like a great big spider web or whatever. And, you know, you run into people and you look at them and you think, I know you, but you haven't actually met, but you have a yap. And you know each other because, oh yeah, you know such and such, and you work up there, and yeah, I've heard about you, and you know, I think that's a really important aspect of this. I mean, I am going to talk a little bit about fish, but I think it's something that we really need to remember in this part of the world. Like, you know, I can remember I broke down just out of Winton in 2010, and because of all the, you know, protocols with work, you had to ring up and sort of say, oh, you know, I've broken down in Winton, and, you know, report it and everything. And, you know, so I had to ring Melbourne to tell them that I was broken down in Winton, you know. And they're saying, oh, are you all right? And, you know, oh, we'll have to, you know, like, it was almost like they were going to air vac you out of the joint. I said, it's okay. Like, I know bootloads of people in Winton. So, you know, we dragged the car to Winton, and I sat around with a mate, and we had dinner, and we had a few beers and fixed the car, and, you know, like, it's just, and that's what I love about it. So, you know, it's just a fantastic bit of the world where you can drive into Boulia or Baduri and you haven't been there for ages, and you just feel pretty comfortable, you know. And that's the same with all the properties I've worked on and all the rest, because, you know, we really have worked all over the joint. But the reason I became interested in this bit of the world was because I started off a little bit further south than Gary, in the Murray-Darling, working on fish. And when you work down there, all you do is pull in carp that long, and it's quite a, you know, unsatisfying experience. It sort of occurred to me that you could spend your whole life pulling in carp that big down there, and, you know, okay, it might be slightly interesting, but, you know, you're not really going to find anything new under the sun, and you're still going to be dealing with the same problems. And also, we weren't really getting a handle on how the rivers work, because down there, they're all regulated by great big headwater dams, as we've discussed, and everybody knows. So if you come up here, the big question is, if you're interested in fish, and I happen to be, if you're a fish, how do you live there? And I apologise to all the people who've seen these slides and this presentation in its rough forms before, but you know, it's a fantastic way to think about it, because, you know, if you've got a life cycle that that says, oh, you know, you've got to have water, but you're living in these highly, you know, as Cliff Bob Cliff, one of them, pointed out before, you know, the most highly variable rivers in the world, then you're going to have some pretty you're going to have to either have some pretty special adaptations, or you're just going to have to be the most easygoing fish in the world, because life could be a little bit of a lottery. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 10 minutes, and it literally will be probably 10 I hope, is just really quickly talk about some basic stuff that I've been doing. To be honest with you, I don't think all the fancy ass science in the world is, you know, going to save the Lake Eyre Basin. I think it's going to be people, you know. But I think the fancy ass science helps. I very much struggle with it, and that's why people like Angela are here to help me out, and Richard. You know, and I'm a pretty basic kind of guy. Like, I ask simple questions like how do fish live in really arid zone rivers. It's as simple as that. So yeah, I'll talk about where they live, just talk a little about recruitment, which is breeding, because if you can do that, then you can survive, and movement, which is obviously pretty important in waterholes that dry down, or sorry, rivers that dry down to waterholes. And then hopefully there'll be enough time to discuss some of this, the really exciting spring communities where I've been working. So right into it. There are 4 very widespread species that you will find in every river in the Lake Eyre Basin. The one on the far left is called a Bony Brim. You can't catch them on a line. Pelicans love them. They eat algae. If it wasn't for them, everything would fall to pieces. The second one's a little pretty one called a rainbow fish. The third one's spangled perch or bobby cod, and they're the ones that are allegedly fall in rains of fishes and swim up wheel tracks and this kind of stuff. And the last one's a fish called a glassfish, which you've probably never seen because they're only small and they're actually transparent. Well, I mean, that's not why you wouldn't see them. You still can see them, obviously. I mean, they're not invisible, but but transparent nonetheless. And so anywhere you go, you'll find these. So we found them right up at the top of, say, the Mulligan River, up in Edgbaston Gorge, out at the base of sand dunes. Angus ran around one day and caught a spangled perch, and they really are the toughest critters on the block. And more on that later. There are also a couple of catfish. There's 2 species. Out here people call them moonfish. The one on the left's called a silver tandan. The one on the right's called a hurdle's tandan. And they sort of school in big numbers, and certainly after flooding. And then there are 3 big, large-bodied species that you find everywhere. The one on the left is called a Welsh's grunter, and the one in the middle is called a Barcoo grunter. But out here people call them brim or black brim. And of course yellow belly, which is the one on the bottom right, and that's what everybody wants to catch, and that's what all the tourists come out here for, and bring their caravans and their generators, and there's occasionally even their illegal nets and their ice boxes, and that's basically the big prize for all the fishermen. Those 9 species are what you'll find everywhere. What's interesting is, if you went to a big long river anywhere else in the world, you would find substantially more species than 9, because obviously if you went to the Amazon, I'd need to have about 3 million photos up there for you. And the reason is because of the aridity. So it's an interesting comparison when you think about just how few species live here. Just to let you know, there's a couple of, this is just to do with what lives where, and some people might be interested, especially the ones who are interested a little bit in tourism and so on. There's a couple of fish that only live in the Cooper in the Lake Eyre Basin, and one's a very boring little critter called a carp gudgeon, and the other one's an equally boring little critter called a smelt. And so these animals have more or less come into the basin from either the east or the south at some time, and for some reason or another have never managed to actually get around to the Diamantina. So even when the rivers flowed all the way down to Lake Eyre, they haven't been able to sort of migrate through. Then again, they're quite small and insignificant, so it's possible that you know, they just became food for something else along the way. And there's also this really iconic big fish that you only find in the Cooper called a Cooper Creek catfish, gets to about that long. And it's interesting that this fish is literally, we call it an endemic species because it's only found in Cooper Creek. So at some time in the dim, dark, distant past, it was stranded and has just evolved as this mud-sucking thing that lives in the bottom of the waterholes. People like to catch them too. If you go out west in the Diamantina and the Georgina, you get a fish called a banded grunter and this strange little beast called a golden goby. And they probably came down from the north because they're widespread across northern Australia and then just entered the basin somehow up there. Or possibly they were there all along. But again, interestingly, not in the Cooper yet. So obviously Lake Eyre, even when it fills, doesn't quite get them across the line. And probably the most interesting discovery over the last couple of years, and this is, where's Brookie? This is all about the Mulligan. This is called a Lake Eyre hardyhead, and they die in their millions on Lake Eyre after it fills. They'd never been found in Queensland. Remember how I said Queensland was where all the rivers were? But interestingly, when we were out in the desert country when that first big rain came in 2009, we found them in Pulsher and Wongeta waterholes up there. And then in the big flood, they're still in the Mulligan system. They're not in the Georgina, so they must just migrate all the way up from down south and then just end up going into this desert river and go berserk for a little while before obviously dying in their thousands. So that's an interesting one, and we'll claim that. Getting onto this recruitment idea, so we kind of looked at the idea of, all right, if you live in a desert river where the flows are really unpredictable and you don't, so in Europe and in the Amazon and in Africa, there's a and even in Northern Australia, there's a predictable monsoon. So if you're an animal that lives in the water and you rely on that, then you're going to breed when the rains come, probably. And it's been demonstrated that that happens. But when we actually analysed all the lengths and the frequency of these species in the western rivers, what we found out was that a fairly large proportion of them, this little list here, actually always have juveniles ready to roll, if you like. So you find them throughout the year, and even in a dry year, not just after a flood. And you'll see that yellow belly's on that list. We found a yellow belly that big just the other month up in the Mulligan. So it's counterintuitive, because you think, oh, fish will breed on a flow, but it's actually out here. They keep breeding all the time, and then when the flow comes, they're ready to capitalise on it. So to give you an example, these are the rainbow fish I talked about before, and this is the big flood in the Georgina in 2007, and this is just the length of the fish. So these are the babies here, if you like. We get the biggest response way late, a whole year after the flood, when all the water holes were drying right back, and they certainly did dry back then, because 2008 was a little bit dry out there. Just to give you the opposite, this is a flood. This is the Hurdle's Tandan catfish I talked about before, and you'll notice that they do have a flood response. So this is the Georgina in 2007. They breed straight after the flow. Then nothing in the Cooper that year, because there was no flood. Straight after the flood in the Cooper in 2010, out come all the babies. Okay, we're also got really interested in this idea of where the fish go, and this is the Mulligan River, which I've been talking about. And so what we did was, this river dries totally back to nothing. Okay, so it only fills on rain, and then it'll go back to water holes, and then most of those water holes will dry down at different rates. So what we did was we chose 6 sites in the Mulligan, and then we measured the fish through time after various floods. So just to give you an idea, this is the water hole when it's full, and this is the water hole a few months later. So things can happen fairly quickly. So what we're finding, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but what we're finding, oh, that's just the paper that's kind of coming along. We're working out that there are 2 kinds of movement strategies, if you like, and we've given them fancy names because that's what you do. Because there are what we call the speculative or wide-ranging species, and these will go to, like, water that deep, and it's going to dry down the next day and all that, and you'll find them all over the shop. Not surprisingly, they're the same ones that were across the top of that first slide. And then you get these more conservative Campbell-Newman style fish that prefer to stay in the water holes that are basically going to hold water for a lot longer. Now, generally, they're the bigger species and the ones that have slightly different reproductive strategies. And the catfish have a bet each way. Moving right along, there are some threats, some aquatic threats in the Lake Eyre Basin. There are goldfish and a fish called gambusia that are present in the Cooper system. That's what goldfish look like when they've been in a river for a while. They sort of don't look like goldfish anymore, and obviously the most likely way that goldfish got into the Cooper is because people kept goldfish and then decided they were quite bored of that, and it wasn't quite as much fun as they thought it would be. Gambusia was introduced to control mosquitoes in the 1920s. Spectacular failure, because mozzies are still around, and they're a really bad pest fish. In fact, they're probably our worst pest fish, and they're widespread throughout the country. You'll see this one's got that big belly. That's because they give birth to live young. Okay, so, and what that means in an Australian context where all the fish lay eggs is that when the babies are born, they come out a whole lot bigger than the babies of our native fish. So guess what happens? They can, what we call, competitively exclude native fish. Only found in the Cooper system so far, cross fingers. There are also what we call a lot of translocated species in the Lake Eyre Basin, and the most commonly translocated species in the Lake Eyre Basin was actually yellow belly, because all the fishing clubs in all the little towns decided that they wanted more fish in the rivers, and they thought the best way to do this, and they still think it, despite being, you know, we keep banging on about how it's not a very good idea, but so they trucked all these fingerlings up from hatcheries down in the Murray-Darling and then released them at Longreach and Ilfracombe and, you know, different places, not Ilfracombe, what was I thinking of? Isisford. Isisford's big on it. They love it. So they'll truck a whole lot of fish up, let them go in the river. The problem with it is that the genetics, you know, if you think about it, the yellow belly that have evolved at Longreach or in the Georgina, say, you know, they've been doing that for a long time, and quite separate from the fish that live in the Murray and the Murrumbidgee. So once you introduce fish from the Murray and the Murrumbidgee, there's a fair chance that if they do really well, they might actually outbreed the local varieties. Trying very hard to stop all this, but it's not as easy as it sounds. And back in the day, and actually the government did all this releasing back in the day, God love them, and they also released Murray cod, because people thought once they started to import yellow belly, they thought, yeah, this is good, we'll get more, we'll get what we really need in the Lake Eyre Basin is a really big fish. We'll get some Murray cod, that'll work, despite the fact that Murray cod are native to, you know, southeastern Australia. And this Murray cod, which I think is one of the ones that was released in 1990 by its size, was hit by a jet ski the other week and reported on by the Longreach leader, and thanks to Angus for the news clipping. Now, we don't know quite how many Murray cod are left, but they do keep turning up from time to time. One of the newer threats is called sleepy cod. This is an East Coast species introduced for aquaculture. You know, we're all going to make a fortune out of aquaculture. That's a great idea. And of course, this is a fish that sits on the bottom of waterholes, got a great big mouth, eats everything else. And when the waterholes dry down, it's not hard to work out that they're going to cause some trouble. But our biggest ecological threat at the moment in the western rivers is certainly red claw crayfish, which everybody likes to eat and all the rest of it, but they're not native to the Lake Eyre Basin. They're native to the northeast, and crayfish are like, you know, armoured tanks, as we can see. And when and worldwide, where you introduce crayfish to a place, they basically take over and wreck it. Oh, they don't wreck it, but they, again, displace native species. So what we're finding in the Lake Eyre Basin rivers when we do sampling is that wherever there's a large concentration of red claw, we don't have the native blue claw crayfish anymore. And, you know, so in Longreach here, people are telling me that they're now catching 1 blue claw to 20 red claw and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, we've all seen those photos of millions and millions of the things falling over the weirs. Okay. I think one of the big problems is that it's very hard to keep getting this message out, certainly about alien species and introduced species and translocated species. You know, in the Lake Eyre Basin, that's all we've got at the moment. It's not perfect, but it's a bootload better than, you know, pretty much any other habited part of Australia, with the exception of the Kimberley and some places that are, you know, just too hard for anybody to get to. So, you know, I really do talk about that as much as I possibly can, do it on the radio and everything, and that's one reason, small plug, why I wrote that little book a couple of years ago, which has been quite well received. And people are genuinely interested in this stuff. The problem is that I think one of our problems, certainly for scientists, is that we write scientific papers and normal people don't read them. You know, and I think it should be, we should all try to do more of this crossover stuff where we don't just sort of keep doing all that stuff that nobody understands, myself included a lot of the time. So, how are we going for time, Dave? How done? Yeah. 3 minutes over. Oh, fair dinkum. All right, just quickly touch on the springs. Okay, sorry, David, you should have told me. There are in Western Queensland, which is underlain by the Great Artesian Basin and also the Lake Eyre Basin, we have groups of Great Artesian Basin springs. So these are groundwater fed systems, and they've got the most unique biodiversity of any aquatic system in that you could imagine. They leave the rivers for dead. And so I've been working for the last 4 years at a place called Edgbaston, which is up in the top of the Cooper catchment. And my big job, if you like, and if you haven't heard about it somehow or other, you must be living under a rock, because the amount of media that it's got is inversely proportional to the size of the fish, which is that big. It's called a redfin blue eye. Only lives in a couple of these tiny springs, shares them with another little critter called Edgbaston goby. These are endemic species again, so like the Cooper Creek catfish, except that they only live in these really isolated little springs. So the big problem at Edgbaston, so the springs are like, they're literally ecosystems that big with a whole lot of snails and plants and weird stuff in that only live there. And the big problem there is that Gambusia are invading the spring complex. So my job over the last few years has been to try to work out how you can fix this and stop the species going extinct. So I've hit them with chemical, I've built fences, I've dug fences, I've moved fish, and I mean, I'm not even going to go near the legislation and all the government regulations because I'll just start swearing. We've thought about moving fish to other places, and now I'm just heading down the track of trying to set up a captive population. I could tell you about this project for half an hour, but I shan't. Suffice to say that we recently, last year, the fish was included in a book on the 100 most endangered species worldwide, put out by the IUCN. So, I mean, if ever the LEB needs a little iconic species, if you've got a fish on the 100 most endangered list in the world, that should fill the bill quite well, and possibly we could make more of it. However, I don't know whether you should be proud of that or not. Just to finish up, since I'm 3 minutes overdue, this is the big flood in Bedourie in 2011. This is how the Lake Eyre Basin works. It definitely works on boom and bust. We all know this. That's a sample of yellow belly from right on the edge of the Simpson Desert in a waterhole that is normally dry. There wasn't one smaller than that. Most of them were up around that size. There was 500 kilos of yellow belly in that net. It's amazing, the difference between the boom times and the bust times. It flows on to the terrestrial ecosystem, so when you get a big boom in the rivers, you'll get a big boom of birds, you'll get a big boom of mammals, and you might have to put your hand down a pitfall trap and pull them out, but I'll let Chris Dickman talk about this tomorrow. But equally and more regularly, this is what the situation is. It's that different. Our challenge going forward is to look after those areas, those critical areas, the springs and the permanent water holes. That's where we should be focusing all our attention in terms of research and in terms of conservation. And that means looking after the whole system, obviously. I've been very lucky because, I've worked all around Australia in isolated areas, and the more I think about it, the more we just have to keep those areas as natural as we can and keep looking at them to try to work out how the place works. So thank you very much.